I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the Executive Director of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. Quite a few of the folks here are staff members and fellows of the Brennan Center who work every day on issues of democracy and justice and the rule of law, and we're also joined by quite a few leaders and activists and thinkers and colleagues from the progressive community and the legal community in New York who grapple with these issues. As most of you know, the Brennan Center is a think tank and advocacy group and public interest law firm all rolled up into one, focusing on these core issues. And our basic premise has been and is that until we fix the systems of our democracy and government, we're not going to solve the problems of the country. That approach seems, to us anyway, as relevant as ever, or more relevant than ever, and we're especially, therefore, really thrilled to be joined by one of the country's leading thinkers about these issues, Professor Hacker. Many of you know that he is a professor at Yale University, previously a professor of political science at Berkeley, is the author of a number of important works of political science which crossed the divide between academic rigor and popular understanding, which is no small feat these days especially. For example, the great risk shift about how the costs of risk in the economy have been placed on the backs of middle-class families and working people, and the need for an innovative and redesigned welfare state to connect up with the world as it actually is. The book that he did with Professor Pearson, his co-author on this book, Off-Center, which really looks at how structural issues have tilted government to the right, especially in terms of redistricting and the structure of Congress. And now this the proposal, I should mention that will be certainly Googleable for many, many years as the originator of the public option, which was such a critical part of the debate, and unfortunately not ultimately part of the final bill in the healthcare plan. And now this book, Winner-Take-All Politics, How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Backs on the Middle Class. You've seen this reviewed in a number of places. It both dives in a really terrific way into some of the broadest trends of inequality and economic dislocation. And I really admire, this is going to sound like damning with faint praise, it really isn't. You have a knack for finding great statistics that tell the story in a compelling way, but also find some counterintuitive and controversial analyses for why policy has come out the way it is and why the economy is as unequal as it's become. So we should mention that we have copies of this book for sale for $9, which is an, even the top 1% would find that a bargain. And I want to thank Janine Plant-Chirlin and Deborah Francois and their colleagues in the Brennan Center Communications Department for putting this together, and the previous similar lunches with Sarah Rosen-Wortel of CAP and with Clarence Jones, and we'll be having more in the future. But right now, we're really delighted to hear from Professor Hacker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here at the Brennan Center. I have a great deal of admiration for the organization, and I'm delighted that I'm able to come here and speak with a whole broad cross-section of people from within it and outside it. I also am really grateful, Michael, for that kind introduction. You you did not damn me with faint praise. I'm often reminded of a quote from Bill Moyers. He once said that it's the mark of an educated man to be deeply moved by statistics, and I like statistics a lot, so I often find that sort of comforting. Maybe I am. Maybe it's my education, not some dysfunction. And I also am glad you didn't say that. You said I straddled the divide rather than falling into the divide between academics and popular politics. Certainly in the healthcare debate, I felt a bit as if I fell into the divide. For those who don't know, ultimately the public option met its fate due to the machinations of my home state senator, Joe Lieberman. Joe, Senator Lieberman, actually was quoted in the New York Times as saying that one of the reasons he was against the compromise that was worked out to try to rescue some version of the public option was that I was apparently for that compromise. And I really didn't know I had such influence. Had I known earlier that I could, induce Joe Lieberman to do things by being against them, I would have come out, strongly in favor of the Iraq War, for example. But anyway, I'll dispense with extended thanks or humor and get to the heart of the matter. But before I do want to I have one last thanks that I want to offer, and that's a thanks to my co-author, Paul Pearson. The two of us have now worked together on two books. Michael mentioned their last book, Off Center, and I at least find it remarkable that he gets along so well with me after that. And I think it's partly because for most of the time that we were writing the book, we were on opposite coasts. I was out at Yale and he was at Berkeley. But I spent a year at Berkeley while we were working on this book, and we got along pretty well then too. So I think we just have a good working relationship. So as I said, I didn't want to spend too long. And whenever I'm sort of in this position where I have 15, 20 minutes to speak, I'm reminded of an evaluation I received when I was just beginning at Yale as an assistant professor, and it began very promisingly. It said, "Professor Hacker, if I had just 15 minutes to live, I'd want to spend it in your class. Because that way it would seem like an hour." I sincerely hope that the next 15 minutes seems like that. So, over the last few months, I've stopped trying to convince people that rising inequality, both economic and political inequality in the United States, is a crucial issue. It seems to be sort of front and center in every debate that we're having right now. It was really driven home to me when I was looking up in the summer of 2010 at some polling that was done by the Pew Research Center, and they asked Americans, it seemed like a pretty innocuous question. They asked them, do you think that the federal government has helped any of these following groups a great deal? And so first they asked about banks and large financial institutions. 53% of Americans said that the federal government helped them a great deal. Then it asked about large corporations, and 44% said great deal of help. And then it asked about the middle class. Maybe we want to hazard a guess at what percentage of Americans thought that the middle class had been helped a great deal over the first 2 years of the Obama presidency?
21.
Who got that? That's amazing. 2%.
Wow.
Yes. So a rather small number. And that, I think, is a sort of backdrop for the story that I want to talk about today. Because in a very real sense, I think that while these seem like sort of overstated perceptions, a kind of pessimism or cynicism about government, I think they have real basis. That I think Americans are disillusioned about their sense that they have political power, in part because there has been a real pulling away of democracy from the broad middle class. And the backdrop for this exploration, if you will, is sort of the startling trends of the last generation, which we describe with this phrase, winner take all. We tend to think of economic inequality in terms of sort of the falling away of the bottom, but really the story of the last generation that's become increasingly clear is the pulling away of the top, right? The very richest of Americans have gotten vastly richer. Most Americans have moved ahead only modestly. And I think when we look at public commentary and discussion about this, at least until recently, there was kind of a sense that this was inevitable, natural, a result of kind of broad trends, changes in our economy, from technology, increasing technological sophistication to globalization, that make it more or less inevitable that there's going to be this pulling away of one section of society or from another. And certainly those who have done so well in this economy have often credited their success to these sort of big shifts in the economy and their innovative ability to take advantage of them. There was an interview with Sandy Weil, the former head of Citigroup, a few years ago, in which he said, you can look at this last 25 years and say it's been an incredibly unique period of time. We didn't wait for somebody else to build what we built, is how he put it. And in a real sense, Sandy Weil is right. He didn't wait for somebody else to build what he built. If you went to his office a few years ago, you would have seen a plaque on his wall, about 4 feet wide. It was wood, had a glass image on it. The image was of Sandy Weil, yes, on his wall. And below it said, shatterer of Glass-Steagall. Because Sandy Weill, of course, was the leading voice challenging the Depression-era law that separated commercial investment banks. Now, the Glass-Steagall repeal, as lots of commentators have noted, is not the precipitating cause of our financial crisis, but it was the capstone to a string of deregulatory moves that were pushed quite aggressively by the financial industry and people like Sandy Weill. And after the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression, it's a lot harder to see those actions as simply sort of the result of inevitable global economic forces on the one hand, or the reflection of sort of the innate ability of these titans of finance to innovate and produce economic gains for our society. You know, the debate over whether financialization of our economy causes greater inequality is a little bit moot after financialization caused the worst economic downturn that we've experienced, all of us have experienced in our lifetimes, and with unemployment still at around 9%, we know that the costs of that financialization have been really broad-based. So that's just one illustration of a larger story that we tell in Winner Take All Politics. It's basically a three-part analysis. The way I like to put it is that we have a sort of puzzle wrapped inside a riddle, wrapped inside a mystery. So the puzzle is why we've seen this very sharp pulling away of the rich, and I'll say a little more about the character of that in a moment. The riddle, if you will, is why, as I'll show and argue, why this has really occurred because of, not in spite of, very substantial changes in our public policies over the last generation. And if public policy is deeply implicated in what's happened, that leads to the great mystery. How? How did this happen in the world's oldest representative democracy, in a country that is really founded on the idea of responsiveness to the broad middle of the distribution of income and power, founded on the ideal that all men are created equal. And so I want to walk us through those three interlocking questions, starting with, of course, this question of what's happened to our economy. Now, Michael kind of set me up. I think there's one figure in the book that kind of nicely summarizes the full story of what's happened over the last generation, and it's this one. And this is based on work on data that the Congressional Budget Office has put together. It includes all sources of income, government taxes, and federal government taxes. It also includes private benefits provided by employers in the health insurance and retirement pension area. So it's really trying to take into account the sort of broadest measure of income that we can look at, and it looks from the late 1970s till 2007. That's the last year available, and I've broken out each of the quintiles. Although I've divided the top fifth into two groups: the 80th to 99th percentiles, and then the top 1%, for reasons that will become quite apparent. So as you can see here, there was in 1979 fairly substantial inequality. You see, the top 1% had an average income of around $400,000. The middle fifth had an average income around $40,000. But if you fast forward to 2007, what you see is really a dramatic pulling away, right? So the top 1% has seen its income increase to around $1.4 million on average, whereas the middle fifth has seen its income increase to around $50,000 on average, which works out to a 25% increase for the middle fifth and a 281% increase for the top 1%. I did have it on here, but sometimes it gets dropped off the top of the chart. And that's just a very stark illustration of how concentrated economic growth has been over these years. If you take all of the gains in income as measured by this after-tax, after-benefit measure, about 40% of them went to the richest 1% over this 1979 to 2007 period. If you look at the most recent period, since the 2000s, more than half went to the top 1%. And really, it's, you know, while this top 1% has done well, they're in some ways, if you look within the top 1%, the picture is very similar to this. It's really the top 1/10 of 1% or 1/100th of 1% that has seen the biggest gains. So the richest 1/10 of 1% has seen its share of national income more than quadruple since the 1970s. So that those 1 in 1,000 households were making in 2007 about 1 in 8 pre-tax dollars in our economy. And wealth, as you probably know, is even more concentrated. The top 1/10 of 1% is a useful group to mention because we actually know, thanks to recent research, a lot more about who's in that top 1/10 of 1%. So yes, it includes superstars in the media, arts, celebrities, sports, but really the bulk of that group, 60%, is executives. About 40% in total is non-financial executives, and about 20% is financial executives. So when you talk about the richest of the rich, you're talking substantially about people who are the working rich, who are making money through executive compensation and through financial transactions. Now, the next question, if that's the pattern of inequality, is why did this happen? And as I said, it's common to say that this is really due to large-scale shifts in our economy. There's a nice, or revealing at least, quote from Hank Paulson back in 2006 when he was sort of forced to confront the reality that inequality was rising. He said, "The fact is that economic inequality is simply an economic reality, and it's neither fair nor useful to blame any political party for it." Now, you can kind of forgive him since we all know which political party he thought was being blamed. But I think that's a very common sense view. Maybe not common sense view, but a very common view is that, well, this really has very little to do with public policy and politics. After all, right, how can we explain the massive amount that folks at the top are taking in even before government taxes and benefits are accounted for? And I think the mistake here, again, is really to sort of assume that inequality is just about the pulling apart of the rungs on the income ladder and not to focus as much on this question of what happened at the very, very top. Because when you start to look within the top 1%, you reach three pretty strong conclusions, all of which point to a fairly fundamental role for public policy. The first is that, yes, the broad changes in our taxes and transfers have not led to sort of a broad pulling apart of American society, say between the bottom third and the top third. But it has led to a very specific decline in taxation on the very richest. And this comes from, as does a lot of the other work in this area, it comes from the work of Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez. So what Piketty and Saez look at is effective tax rates, and they're looking here at federal tax rates. So the effective tax rate is not the marginal tax rate, and you will often hear people say, well, marginal tax rates were 90% in the 1940s and 50s. But the reality is, of course, that not everyone who was making money that would put them in that tax bracket were actually paying that rate. What you really want to look at is what's the effective tax rate? What are people actually paying as a share of their income? And if you look over the last generation, you can see that there has been a fairly substantial decline in the effective tax rate on the richest 1%. It's gone from around 50% to around 30%. That's pretty remarkable if you think about it, given the trends we're talking about. So over this period in which income growth has accrued to the top 1%, we've also cut taxes, federal taxes on the top 1%. However, it's really within the top 1% that you start to see the substantial decline in tax rates. In a way, what we can say is that our tax code used to be progressive all the way up the income ladder. Now it's really not progressive at the very top. Warren Buffett recently said that he thinks he's paying a lower tax rate than his assistants are. And these numbers suggest why. I mean, the most egregious example of this is the carried interest provision that allows hedge fund managers to pay a 15% capital gains tax rate on a large chunk of their multi-million-dollar incomes. So what we've seen is not a worsening of the distribution broadly, but really a very concentrated series of economic smart bombs, if you will, for the very richest, right? That rather than normal bombs, right, have been quite welcome. They shower payloads of cash onto their carefully selected recipients. Even so, I don't think this alone is not going to explain why we've seen pre-tax incomes explode for those at the top. And I think if there's a real strong source of skepticism about the idea that policy mattered, it's really this idea that, well, how can you understand what's happened with pre-tax incomes as a result of public policy? And so in the book, we argue that there are really two fundamental mistakes that people make when they dismiss the role of government in shaping pre-tax incomes. The first is to think of markets as somehow pre-political and pre-governmental, right? After watching Republicans go after unions in recent years, but especially recent months, or watching what happened due to the deregulation of financial markets, it's pretty hard to dismiss the idea that the basic rules that govern the market have a big influence on the relative power of market actors and the ability of some people to accrue large fortunes. In a sense, the financial deregulation story is a perfect illustration of the way in which you can remake markets through public policy in a fashion that can really create fundamental fundamental changes in the distribution of economic rewards. And this was not inadvertent, right? It was not accidental, right? Those who were pushing for these deregulatory changes were doing so and investing in politics because they saw real strong reasons for doing so in terms of the effect of these changes on their bottom line. That's pretty obvious, and I'll say more about that kind of investment in a moment. The other thing the other side of this is a little less obvious, is we don't want to just look at market making in terms of active government policy, but also what government fails to do, right? And so there have been fundamental shifts in our economy. In particular, right, there has been very dramatic shifts in what is often called financial innovation in the technologies of the financial sector, and government largely failed to police these changes, right, in ways that also allowed those at the top to reap large rewards. And again, this was not inadvertent, right? In the book, we talk about two key examples. One is industrial relations policy. I'll only mention here that American unions, right, entered the 1970s facing a much more hostile set of policies for the challenges they faced than the unions in almost any other country. And one of the reasons for that was that they were not protected against the threats to unionization that occurred due to the ability of corporations to move their operations to other parts of the United States. And so they also were not protected against the shifts that were taking place as production was moving from manufacturing to services. They needed, in other words, a reboot of industrial relations law, and many unions, despite this common view that they had their head in their sands, recognized this. In 1978, they sought a huge revamp of industrial relations law, and many people expected it was going to happen. But in the book, we talk about 78 as kind of the great turning point when a lot of the forces that mobilized to push for these policy shifts that I've been talking about really saw the opportunity to remake American policy and politics in ways that would favor their interests. And so in 1978, under President Carter, with Democratic majorities, there ended up being a really unprecedented political battle over labor law reform that featured a filibuster on the Senate floor. I know that sounds like, yeah, filibuster, I'm shocked. But in fact, this was extremely uncommon on non-civil rights issues back in the 1970s. And who was leading that charge? I think, well, one of the people was this very young, fresh-faced senator from Utah named Orrin Hatch, they did a real filibuster. They shut down the Senate for the entire summer of 1978. And in the end, they won. And it was a huge rout for labor, which had really saw this as the opportunity to revamp industrial relations law. Within a few years, of course, corporations were taking advantage of it. But this is well before PATCO, the air traffic controllers strike, well before the kind of early 1980s stacking of the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, by Reagan. This was in the late 1970s, and it was the failure to make changes to the framework that was crucial, not the passage of new laws. Similarly, with financial deregulation, in the SEC, people like Arthur Levitt were fighting it over and over again with Robert Rubin, with key members of Congress, notably Phil Gramm, Republican of Texas, to try to get new laws passed that would regulate stock options and the accounting practices of firms with regard to executive compensation and with regard to stock options. And in all cases, they were basically rebuffed, right? These did not become prominent issues because they were shut down, basically, by politicians who were quite responsive to the industry interest in question. My favorite quote regarding this is from Phil Gramm. Levitt comes up to him at one point on the accounting front and says, "We really need new rules," and Gramm looks to him and he says, somewhat presciently it turns out, "Unless the waters are crimson with the blood of investors, I don't want you engaging in any regulatory flights of fancy, right? Well, a few years later, the waters were crimson, right? But Phil Gramm was gone, discredited as it turned out because of his involvement with UBS, and it was too late, right? I mean, the damage is done. The trillions have been lost. But people recognize this, people in positions of power as well, but they didn't act. And this of course, leads to the fundamental question: why didn't they act? I mean, I've already hinted at the answer, but I want to try to provide a kind of broader picture here. What happened politically over this period, right? Why was 78 a turning point and not, say, 68 or 64? Why was the forces that were pushing against updating the social contract or financial regulations, why were those forces successful? And so in the book, we talk about this in a way that I think is unfamiliar to commentators who really want to look for like grand conspiracy theories. In fact, so probably the most disappointing moment in all the rollout of this book, and it's been a really wonderful period in general, notwithstanding what's happening in American politics, was when we wrote this piece for Bloomberg, which they have titled "Inside the Wealth Conspiracy." And I didn't like the title because our story is really it's not a conspiracy story. I mean, there are conspirators, and the Koch brothers are part of the story, and Lewis Powell's famous memo in the 1970s is sort of like a counterpart to Justice Brennan. Lewis Powell's famous memo when he was heading the Chamber of Commerce legal group, saying that business needed to organize, features in. So there is definitely people who are scheming and trying to change American politics by organizing. But it's much more about how the mobilization of business in the 1970s and 80s, and occurring alongside the decline of a lot of traditional organizations that once represented middle-class Americans, from unions to civic groups, changed the Washington ecosystem, right? So that everyone, Democrats as well as Republicans, had to adjust, had to adapt, right? So a lot of this is about sort of decentralized responses to new political and economic realities, right? But what is consistent is that these new incentives, right, are pushing in a direction that is reinforcing the advantages of those who are mobilizing during this period and seeking favorable public policy. And I think that the one way to understand this that's different from the conspiracy view is that a big part of this story is not about massive policy breakthroughs, but about stalemate, as I was talking about the increasing incapacity of our government to respond to the major economic changes that are taking place. And obviously part of that story is the filibuster, right? So I mentioned Orrin Hatch, and I think it was Byrd, actually, was the other senator who was joining him. So you had a sort of Democratic-Republican alliance against the labor reforms. I mentioned that was pretty unusual, and it was. Historically, the filibuster was actually a fairly rare event up until you see this sort of spike here with the civil rights struggles, but really it's the last generation that's seen the most dramatic increase in cloture motions to end filibusters. Just to give you the numbers here, in the 40 years before 1970, there were fewer than 40 cloture votes in total. In the 40 years after 1970, there have been 800 cloture votes, and more than 200 in the last 2 years, right? This is a quasi-constitutional change. It's one that the founders, the designers of our Constitution, would have viewed with a great deal of ambivalence, if not outright hostility. Alexander Hamilton, in the Federalist Papers, wrote a bit about how he thought it was necessary to limit the number of cases where you would have the number of instances in which you would have supermajority requirements. So he believed in the presidential veto, for example. He believed that you needed to have a higher hurdle for constitutional change. But then he wrote, drawing on an example that we forget now, but the Polish Sen, right, which had this rule called liberum veto. Basically, any nobleman could ride it by horseback into the parliament, I guess not into the parliament, but to the parliament, run in, shout liberum veto, and no action could be taken, right? So it was an absolute veto for all of the represented noblemen. And this was actually a big example that they drew on. I mean, the contemporary Senate looks a little bit like the Polish Parliament. And he says, upon some occasion, things will not admit of accommodation, and then the measure of government must be injuriously suspended or fatally defeated. It is often by the impracticability of obtaining the concurrence of the necessary number of votes kept in a state of inaction. Its situation must always savor of weakness, sometimes border upon anarchy. Okay, so that sounds a bit like the healthcare debate to me, but now, okay, Hamilton, right, was really pro-executive, pro-government in a lot of ways, but Madison felt the similar way. In fact, here he has a statement in some ways that's stronger. He says that if he said, yes, sometimes you need to have supermajority requirements, and sometimes that will slow down hasty or impractical measures, but he says, weighing in the other side, is that in all these cases where justice of the general good requires action, the fundamental principle of free government would be reversed, right? The majority wouldn't rule, it would actually be the minority. And in the contemporary Senate, that minority could represent, at the extreme, about 10% of the American electorate because of the 2-senator per state rule. So I don't want to overstate the filibuster. It's not the only factor here, but it's revealing, I think, of this story I want to tell, where it's not just big changes in tax and transfer programs. It's also changes in markets, and some of those changes are changes that are basically occurring because of the failure of government to act in a much more polarized and stalemated political environment. So the other side of the story, though, is why is the pressure coming so consistently from those who are benefiting from these economic shifts and policy changes? And here, I think, we have to pay attention to money in politics, but not just campaign money. In fact, corporations spend vastly more on lobbying than they do on campaign spending, and that's true despite, of course, the outpouring of money in politics. So, it's really worth keeping in mind that a big part of the story is the really concerted efforts of organized economic interest to try to reshape policy over the long term. This is from beyond electoral fights. It's a long-term engagement in policy, and just recently I had this argument vindicated by I think a real authority on it, David Koch. He said our main interest is not participating in campaigns. Our main interest is in policy, right? And if you think about that, right, about sort of what it takes to make policy over the long term, voters are a lot of disadvantage unless they have organizational representation, unless they can be made aware of the complex features of policy and engaged over the long term on policy, right? They're always going to be at a very substantial disadvantage to those who are organized and intense and engaged across multiple branches and levels of government for the long term, right? And what we talk about in the book is how that organization occurred within the business community and financial sector in the 1970s and 1980s, and has been sustained even as many of the organized representatives of the broader public have lost ground. Now, I know that at this point you're probably feeling a little depressed, and I just want to try to offer what I hope is a little bit of an uplifting message at the end, because I get a lot of people coming up to me afterwards and saying, sometimes they say I don't like the book, but usually they say I like the book. That's the people that come up to you at events, and they say, but it really left me depressed, and it's a really depressing book, and I say thank you, and then I say, well, but I don't think it's as depressing a story as the one you're used to hearing, right? So the common story that we hear every day now, it's coming not just from Republicans, but also increasingly from the White House, right, is that we face this massive shift in the economic environment that has led to this new competitive pressures. The middle class is inevitably going to fall behind. Inequality is a reflection of, as I said, of these sort of large impersonal forces beyond our control. Our story is much more a political one, right? The middle class was built in the mid-20th century, as David Callahan and others have persuasively argued, and the middle class was unmade, in a sense, right, through these changes, these policy changes that helped elevate the super rich. And if that's the case, then our problem is in some ways more tractable, right? It's the problem of restoring a well-functioning, responsive democracy. Now, Walter Lippmann in the early 20th century, when faced with this quandary, described it as basically democracy has to pull itself up by its own bootstraps. And that's a tough problem, right? The catch-22 of winner-take-all politics is the only way we can fix winner-take-all politics is to work through our broken political system, right? But it's a much more, I hope, inspiring vision than one that says, look, we just have to get used to these high levels of inequality that are approaching those of third-world nations, because it's the nature of modern American capitalism. And in the question and answer session, I'd be delighted to talk a little bit about some of the reforms that I think might help. But sort of the theme that I'd want to stress right now is that far more than kind of economic policy reforms, we need to have political reforms. We need to have an effort to try to create and recreate, or at least recreate, the kind of middle-class democracy of the mid-20th century, where Americans of modest means, who didn't have much economic capital, had a great deal of political capital, and that's a really fundamental challenge. It's a challenge that FDR and TR recognized. And if you go back and look at the debates of the early 20th century, the progressive era up through the New Deal, it's striking how often politicians really articulated this as the fundamental problem, and it's striking how infrequently it gets discussed in these terms today. I mean, TR said the supreme political task of the day is to drive the special interest out of our political life. FDR said that political equality is meaningless in the face of economic inequality. He said a lot of other things that would make today's bankers, who seem pretty upset when they get called fat cats, go home crying, right? And so we've lost that kind of, that broad kind of egalitarian populist tradition of discourse. And I think if these numbers tell us anything, is we need to reclaim it. So thanks very much.
Microphones for the questions and comments, but I don't have a microphone, but I want to claim the first question.
Okay.
One of the things you talk about in your book is not only the greatly increased and highly effective mobilization of the economic interests of that top 1% or conservatives, but also the declining effectiveness of mobilization by what would be seen as more progressive or folks speaking for the economic interests of the bottom 99%. And you talk about the decline of unions, which were a really major political force, not only on economic issues but on civil rights, the decline of even the American Legion when it was a progressive economic force. And you tell a story which has been told by others as well of how, to the degree there is organization among progressives, it's sort of atomized into non-material issues or balkanized into social groups, but in any case there's not this speaking on these core economic issues. That's a challenge that we face all the time because of course what we work on at one level could be seen as non-material, but on another level is what you need to do to get to the broader issues of equality. And so how do you, could you talk about that, and how do you see the political reforms you talked about at the very end as anything other than more of the post-economic liberalism that started really in the 70s and after that?
Well, I mean, I think that there is a strong temptation on the part of progressives to come back to those kind of post-material issues, to come back to environmentalism, civil rights, to come back to feminism as the sort of sole area of organization. And you know, it's not as if I don't think those are crucial issues, but there's a real neglect, I think, of sort of organizing around bread and butter economic concerns. I mean, an illustration of this, and then I'll say more about sort of where I think it should go, but I think an illustration of this that's really telling is that during the fight over the estate tax repeal in the early 2000s, the organized labor was really the only group that was active on the side, the anti-repeal side. It turned out, right, the most effective anti-repeal group was a bunch of billionaires who were worried about charitable contributions. So if ever there's a great illustration of winner-take-all politics, right, it's that David's written about the new liberal rich, that they showed up a little bit late to the party on this one, right, but started to say that the estate tax was essential, mostly because it was, you know, fueling a lot of philanthropic contributions. William Gates Sr. was sort of the key organizer there. But the organized labor was active on it. They had one staffer working 1/4 time on all tax issues during this period, right? So it was an incredibly imbalanced fight. And if you look at where there was progress in this last couple of years, right? I mean, as we describe in the book, politics is about organized combat, right? A lot of politics is basically trench warfare between opposing sides, but of course, in a lot of times, you know, you basically had guys in tanks fighting lightly armed rebels, you know, who are trying to defend existing policies, or pursue new ones. You know, there are two exceptions in the sense that I think many people would be struck by the fact that we were able to pass a set of healthcare reforms that, while more modest than I wanted, is still pretty substantial, and also pass financial reform. The former, I think, and again, I think the financial reform is actually much more modest in many ways than the healthcare bill, but in both those cases, there was concerted organizing efforts on the other side that were trying to bring together groups. The resources were never as large, but Americans for Financial Reform and Healthcare for America Now on healthcare, right, were actually there day in, day out, publicizing what was at stake. Now, on financial reform, I think it was a clear illustration that the public was really with reformers, as they were with core elements of healthcare reform that were dropped, like the public option. And with, you know, the sense of outrage people had about what had happened on Wall Street was really the sort of engine fueling that debate. But it suggests, right, the outrage has to be channeled, right? And so if you looked at the 2010 midterm elections, or if you look at the Tea Party, right, a huge amount of anger at the bailout is behind these results and organizations. In the 2010 midterm, when you asked people who's responsible for the economic crisis, people said the banks, President Bush, and Obama in that order. Of those who said the banks, 2/3 voted for Republicans, right? Even though Republicans like John Boehner were there trying to get the financial industry off the hook, so to speak. Boehner's great moment in this debate was when he got a bunch of Wall Street lobbyists together and told them they had to stand up to those punk Democratic staffers on Capitol Hill, right? So, you know, rallying the powerful. So there is some hope in that. So, but the real challenge is to try to create some kind of sustained organizational presence on these issues, and recognizing that just how difficult it is for many people to make those kind of connections between complex policies and their daily lives. And so I think that you can see some promising signs in contemporary efforts by, say, Change to Win or Move On to try to move a bit towards bread and butter economic concerns. But we shouldn't kid ourselves, right? A lot of the money, which David has written about, kind of the new liberal rich, a lot of the online activism, right, is not organized around those issues, right? And moreover, and I think this is really crucial, right, is that it historically was sort of mass engagement that mattered, right? That you didn't just have savvy organizations in Washington, right? But that they had broad-based memberships, right? They were able to deploy their energies across multiple sites of government, including the states, right? And so I do think we see some stirrings of that, but it is the fundamental challenge. And I understand that it's hard for progressives, particularly progressives with money, to think that investing in those kind of long-term organization-building efforts is worthwhile, given the sort of short-term challenges of defending existing policies and programs. But to me, that's really the area where I think the real investment has to take place. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. A couple of thoughts. I'm Susan Werner from Common Cause New York. One of the things that we are actively engaged in is in trying to organize some sort of a unified effort around tax day this year. There are a lot of progressive groups that want to do something, and that means each one of them wants to do something different,
Right.
with their own name
Right.
on it, and their particular part of the argument. So we do definitely face a challenge in what we're trying to do with Common Cause is to create a frame that they can all share, lift up whichever part of the argument, but under the message of the tax system is broken, it needs to be fixed. It's broken because the millionaires are not paying their fair share. It's broken because the corporations are not paying their fair share, B of A, or whichever one you want to hit up on, GE, B of A, whatever, and that we need systemic change so that we can fix the system. And I'm curious, one of the things that struck me when you say that, the Titans say this is a unique period. I don't think this is a unique period at all. I think that when we look back at the technological shifts of the mid to late 19th century, we see the same sort of rapacious wealth creation. And what I'm curious about, and I'm wondering if you have looked at, is the actual antecedents of the progressive movement. Because it did not spring, and I haven't researched it yet, but I am starting to think about, we need to go back to that history and look at how did they create a movement that was broadly based across the country, that TR didn't have these thoughts by himself. TR was the culmination of what I have begun to learn is a lot of organization, a lot of education, a lot of barnstorming, a lot of lecturing. And now that's as much as I know about it. And I'm wondering if anybody is looking at lessons that we can learn from that time period to build the movement that we need. And the second thought is that there is no question that the funders for the far right have invested in long-term thinking and planning, and the funders for our issues have invested in deliverables in 6 months.
Right.
And that will always hobble us until we have a broader-based movement where we can get $10 from 1 million people with a compelling message.
Well, so, I mean, a lot of that is reflections to which I'm very congenial. Let me just say a couple words sort of riffing off of your thoughts. I mean, first on the need for tax reform, the concern about the lack of progressivity in our tax code, particularly at the top. This is one of those areas where there is a fundamental disconnect between where Washington is in this debate and where Americans are. Because when you look at public opinion, right, people may disagree on a lot of things. They all seem to agree that the rich pay too little as a share of taxes, that we should, that we should have ended the tax cuts passed in 2001 and 2003 for the wealthiest. And and you might say, well, these are not like deeply held beliefs; they're just sort of superficial. But even among those who showed up to the polls in November 2010, the majority said, the plurality said, the largest group said that we should end the tax cuts for the richest, right? So that, and simultaneously, right, you find in all these polls an enormous amount of reservoir of support for existing social programs that are all on the chopping block, right, or going to be on the chopping block soon. So, I mean, part of our argument in the book is that to understand this is simply a reflection of kind of where the public is, as is done in these kind of endless dissections of, what's the matter with Kansas or working class voters, is a mistake. That a lot of what we have to understand is that their agenda setting and organizational influence, right, are directed much more by those who are interested in preserving these goodies or expanding them than by sort of general public opinion. So that, of course, raises this question of, well, how can how can the public be engaged? If you go back to the progressive era, and I've done a little of this, it's an interesting combination of elite and mass mobilization, and there's a huge amount of ferment, right, during this period. And you've got populism, of course. You have, if you go forward to the 1930s, right, you have an enormous organization representing the elderly, the Townsend movement, and you can see examples of broad-based organizations over this period. I mean, we forget just how densely populated American civic life was in the early 20th century. But at the same time, the main groups that were doing the coordination of activities across states, say the American Association for Labor Legislation, were pretty elite-oriented organizations. In fact, part of the problems in the progressive era were these were muggle-on reformers who believed that they should get a lot of people out of politics in many cases, right? That they wanted to make sure that there wasn't, the party's influence wasn't as great as it was in elections and the like. So there were tensions there, but they were very, and there was also a lot of elite reformers within government, right? Lafayette, Robert Wagner, right? And so I think that that's worth keeping in mind, is that we tend to sort of romanticize direct citizen action and on the left, and sort of humanize elite organizational behavior. But what's really the problem, right, is the disconnect, right? And actually the lack, in many cases, of citizen mobilization more broadly. It's kind of reaching that, marrying those two. One thing that I think the progressive era really showcases is they were fighting for social reforms, for policies, right? I mean, the big AAL's campaign was for eliminating the use of phosphorus in matches that was causing horrible disfigurement of workers, and also for just generally worker compensation reforms in general. And they formed alliances to do that that were very odd, right? Like getting the business community engaged, because business was getting trashed in the courts. So they were very savvy about creating strategic alliances around very concrete kind of policy reforms, agendas, right? From pensions to health insurance to workers' comp to more general kind of reforms of public health and working conditions. But overarching this was a constant emphasis on political reform. And what do we think of, and political reform broadly construed, so changing the scope of what government could do, as well as changing the relative balance of political forces. So what are some examples? Well, here's a big one, right? Suffrage, right? The creation of the first income tax, right? Transformation of the balloting and election process in ways that had both positive and negative effects. But it is very notable the extent to which political reform was kind of an overarching theme of a lot of the progressive reform. I feel as if, and this is something that has sort of come up indirectly, that that the language of political reform has become incredibly hollowed out in contemporary era, right? It revolves almost entirely around campaign finance reform, and entirely around what I would call kind of demand-side strategies, like how can we limit the amount of money that people are able to contribute? And it's a losing cause, right, given where the Supreme Court is. But the other side of this, right, thinking more broadly about political reform, about trying to make dollars matter less in politics, about creating counterweights to the organized weight of those at the top, that side of it, I think, is far more important and far less discussed. And it may be that, as I said before, and I don't want to get too, Foucaultian about this or sort of post-structuralist, but it is true that I think the language of economic and political reform has been really drained of a lot of its important content. Going back to this very fundamental fact that Americans believe strongly in political equality, even if they're ambivalent about aspects of economic equality. The National Election Study asked, so I mentioned the middle class poll, the National Election Study has been asking for about 50 years this question about, do you think that ordinary Americans or special interests are dominate politics, or something like that. And in the 1950s, it was 70-30 in favor of ordinary Americans. In recent years, it's been 70-30 in favor of the idea that special interests dominate. I think that's the most corrosive aspect, in a sense, of people's perceptions of politics, far more than their sense that they're too taxed, far more than their sense that the DMV doesn't work well. It's just a sense that government is distant from them, that it's operating on a set of principles other than responsiveness to Americans. Because once there is that disconnect, right, every other goal that you might have, that progressives might have, right, becomes compromised, right? Because you can convince people they're getting screwed at work, or that those at the top are earning unearned gains or putting the rest of the economy at risk. You just can't convince them that we as a society and as a government, democratic government, can do anything about it, right? And if you're in a situation where you don't believe government can do anything about it, then you're far more attracted to the idea that the best that you can get is a handful of tax cuts. It might be tiny, but at least it's some small share of the amount that's being showered on those at the top. Yeah, and I'll keep my responses more brief.
I'm just to kind of take that a step farther in terms of if we fix this information gap, if we fix an understanding gap about tax policies, get people to closer. As an East Coast elitist, I hear myself saying that out loud. But I'm wondering, I'm still skeptical about the extremely effective coupling with social issues.
Yeah.
And I just wonder how you react to the idea that somebody with as perfect economic information as they might have might still see that as somewhat intangible and farther off than, say, the direct impact of getting the people that you vote for, to immediately outlaw abortion. And that happens, and we see it, and social issues allow, most legislators to be immediately reactive to that kind of social base. And so I'm just wondering if you really think there's a tractable solution that closes the information gap, or whether people will say, hey, elitist, I know that these people aren't helping me on that issue, but that's not what I'm voting on today.
Well, I do agree that it's not just a matter of getting broader-based information out there, sort of educating Americans, right? Because education or knowledge has to be linked to power. Middle-class democracy, right, was a combination of information about what was at stake in debates and a sense, based on one's own engagement with these organizations, that you can make a difference, right? And so I think that latter part is really crucial. So I'll put that as an aside, but I kind of go back and forth on the social issue, the importance of social issues. So at an organizational level, I think it's a remarkable achievement of the Republican coalition to marry these two fairly disparate factions, namely those who care primarily sort of about libertarian economic policy outcomes, even if the policy outcomes that are being pursued are anything but libertarian, in the sense that they're just messing with markets in a different way than liberals want to mess with markets, in a way that's much less conducive to good social outcomes. But with marrying that sort of libertarian economic position with a kind of strong emphasis on social morality that has brought in white evangelical Protestants, and that's one way to think about this, as we write about it in the book, is that we tend to focus on this at the individual level, but as an organizational achievement, it's remarkable because regardless of whether or not those individuals are prioritizing, social issues that gives the Republican coalition this enormous amount of electoral slack, right? That allows them to pursue policy aims that strikes me as often being fairly, of which broad majorities are fairly skeptical. And we're going to see a test of that, I think, in the coming months. But when you start to delve down into public attitudes and views, I think my own take on it is that, you know, in one sense, this is a take born of kind of realism about the ability to attract hardcore social conservatives to kind of a progressive economic platform, if, as it almost certainly will have to be, it's tied to the Democratic Party, a renewed Democratic Party. But part of it is based on an actual look at the evidence. Is I think that when you start to think about it, a lot of the defections of working class voters from the Democratic Party are motivated not primarily by social issues or religious conservatism, but by a real strong sense that it's sort of twofold. On the negative side, that the Democratic Party isn't offering a response. And on the positive side, it's actual attraction to some of Republican economic ideas. I have a student in one of my classes, Inequality in American Democracy, who's been charting the kind of, going back to the early 20th century, the kind of rise of a strong marrying of a kind of free market fundamentalism and social fundamentalism in the United States. And so we shouldn't, and when you look at evangelical conservatives, it's the most educated and most informed are actually quite consistently conservative on both economic and social issues, whereas less educated, less informed are more divided, whereas where they have economic, quite a few kind of very strong economic liberal views. So it seems like if that when you look at social conservatives as a group, they are often indistinguishable from the electorate as a whole on support for Social Security and Medicare, or even on support for progressive taxation, but the organizational activation, right, is taking place much more on those economic issues. So I don't have an easy, and that's a kind of summary of the problem, I don't have an easy solution. I think we should recognize, though, that that may be the sort of struggle of the past 40 years. The next struggle will be about new elements of the electorate, right, that are growing, and the degree to which they can be brought to support a more progressive economic policy agenda. And here I think there's more cause for optimism. I think one of the reasons for worry or skepticism is just to recognize that there's nothing inevitable or natural about new electorates, whether it be young voters who are coming into the fold or Hispanic voters who are making up a larger and larger share of voting population in many parts of the country, remaining tied to the kind of basic philosophies that they have today. And in fact, we have lots of historical precedent, right, for partisan competition over new voters taking place, and those who once had the advantage losing ground. And if you look at these new electorates, especially younger voters, what you find is that social issues are not that resonant in many cases, but skepticism towards government and division over kind of economic policies is. And that's where I think the next big fight will have to come. And to me, the real problem is that, you know, we talk about, oh, one side is populist and the other side is moderate, but really the next step is to construct a kind of vision of an active government in the 21st century that is engaged in taking on long-term challenges, from global warming to rising healthcare costs,